Welcome on this glorious sunny evening, if you're in the UK, to our next Rhododendron, Camellia and Magnolia group talk for online. And we have with us this evening the lovely Rosemary Legrand, and she is joining us from near Wimborne in Dorset and is going to be giving us a wonderful talk as part of our new Plant Passions series of talks. It's the first one in the series, so I'm really excited, and I know Rosemary well, and she's going to give us a real treat, I think, this evening, talking about azaleas and rhododendrons, and her father, who was a rhododendron and azalea breeder and nurseryman, George Hyde, and what it was like being his daughter growing up. And well, really, I just need to hand over to you now, Rosemary, and you can tell us all about it.
Thank you very much, Gwendolyn. Well, let me get the talk up. Lovely. I hope everybody can hear me. Gwendolyn, can you hear me?
Yes, I think sound is all
good.
Great.
Great. I'm getting some thumbs up. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And it is quite extremely hot here in Dorset, near the coast. Well, Gwendolyn asked me to do a talk for Plant Passions, my life in azaleas and rhododendrons. Well, I actually can't remember the time when rhododendrons weren't part of my life. They were part of our family. I must just check with Gwendolyn. On my screen, there is a message. It isn't obscuring your message, is it? Your screen, Gwendolyn?
No.
It's a message saying that the meeting is being recorded.
Yes, no, it's not obscuring anything.
It isn't. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, as part of my life, as I say, rhododendrons, azaleas and camellias were always there. My father was a hybridist and a nurseryman, George Hyde, and this particular photograph of me as a child was in part of the nursery, and it was very close to an area where we grew Rhododendron Edgeworthii, which was a great favourite of mine. But at the time, when I was a child, it was referred to as Rhododendron Verlatum. And this is a picture of my father and my mother. These are actually photographed from photographs, so not as clear or sharp as perhaps today's photographs. And this was them together at Wisley, where many of my father's azalea hybrids went to and can still be seen today. So life was very busy. And I spent hours with my rhododendron hybridist in his glass houses and the propagating house, because my father was a great storyteller. And sometimes when it was cold and or the rain was beating on the glass panes of the propagating house, it was a good place to be. And he would tell me these stories, and I'd be spellbound about these amazing places where the rhododendrons came from, like Assam and Bhutan and Sichuan, and all these fantastic places. So I longed to go there. And I was very fortunate because back in 2009, I did indeed go to Bhutan. And it was just so exciting seeing the species growing in their own habitat. There is nothing more exciting than seeing plants growing in their native place. And this is at 3,810 meters on the Cheli La. And in Bhutanese, that means La means a high pass. And you can see the conditions where some of these rhododendrons were growing. You can see the very treacherous paths, very rocky, unstable paths. And this is where I saw Campanulatum growing, gorgeous, delicate lilac blooms, almost translucent, and Rhododendron arboreum. And we found these in that situation. We also saw Lanatum. And this is another plant which has this gorgeous indumentum which protects it. And I think and I've always felt this even from a child, it's the texture of the plants, it's the touching of the leaves, it's like Eucushimanum, it's like velvet. And those are some of the features that I just love about the species. But it's the plants that are growing around them in these areas that take your eye as well. This is Primula calderana and Primula denticulata. And I mean, these are plants, the drumstick primula, that we grow in our gardens, but not on this scale, where they cover meadows, they carpet them. And then there were rhododendrons like Cinnabarinum. And this was an area just wholly covered with Cinnabarinum. And of course, there are a lot of self-hybrids because there were colours from palest primrose through to tangerine, glowing tangerine. And this gorgeous canary yellow Cinnabarinum we saw in a different part of Bhutan. All these plants, like cassia as well, give us the great scope of the shape of the blooms, let alone the shape of the leaves, all so inspiring, and a valley of sheer and utter gold with falconeri growing, and all the previous year's seed was all over the moss-covered ground. And of course, wonderful falconeri with its great trusses of these delicate lemon bells. But perhaps the greatest thrill was going back to that early boletum, which of course is Rhododendron edgeworthii, and to see that growing in Bhutan in its habitat. And if you look at the picture on the left-hand side of the screen, right at the top of that cliff, in that left-hand corner, you'll see a little bit of white blossom, and that is where the Rhododendron edgeworthii was growing. And we were down on the road, so we got out our binoculars and our cameras to capture it. We weren't anywhere near it. But our driver, Kinzang, he actually scrambled up the rocks and he cut us a piece of the blossom, much to our consternation, because we didn't really want him to cut it. But there you can see those wonderful blossoms, white, blushed with pink, and that fantastic foliage, which is dark olive green and leathery. And again, it's the texture. That's what I love about the rhododendrons, but also it's the scent with edgeworthii. And it's intoxicating. My mother and I used to say that the nearest we could compare it to was sweet nutmeg. This, if you can imagine sweet nutmeg as a perfume, simply gorgeous. And this is where the beauty to me isn't just in the blooms. Now, this is a newly acquired, really exciting rhododendron from Vietnam, which we have in our garden. It's Rhododendron suoiliense. And just look at that sumptuous foliage. Who needs blooms? And it doesn't just take the new growth or the mature leaves, it's often the calyx with the flowers. And these are another, the Rhododendron lutescens, that is another rhododendron that holds fond memories for me from my childhood. Beautiful, delicate flowers, again with this translucent quality, a sort of chartreuse yellow, but it's the color of the foliage as well. The new growth is ruby red, and this is a lovely form, Bagshot Sands. It's not the form I knew as a child, it's more improved. And it was a gift from the great plantsman, member of our group, Barry Starling. And it was Barry who accompanied our group from the RCM when we went in 2008. To the year after I went to Bhutan, we went to Yunnan, and we had a unique opportunity as a group, rhododendron group, to go, and we saw some fantastic blooms. And this is Rhododendron Decorum, and it was one of the rhododendrons that my father used quite a bit in his hybridization. We also saw Rhododendron impedatum, which is a little jewel, a little gem, and it's a very adaptable rhododendron. It'll grow on a rockery, it'll grow in tough conditions, and that's where we saw it in its habitat, which gave us such an insight into the planting conditions for some of the species rhododendrons, which we often cosset. And really, when you see them growing in their homes, in their home countries, they're in really very poor conditions. Racemosum was another rhododendron we saw in Yunnan, and I shall never forget this apparition. The Tibetan lady in that previous picture, was holding Incarvilia Maryi in her hands, but behind her was this vast expanse of Racemosum, and as we approached it, it was like heather. We could have been in Scotland, and you could have seen all the heather in bloom. It was just astonishing. So all these amazing sites give us an insight, and of course, to go to Yunnan, you had to see Rhododendron yunnanense in flower, as we did, and it was absolutely magnificent. Just look at the prolific bloom. Again, delicate lilac blossoms, so inspiring. Now, my father never got to these places, much as he would have dreamed of going there. He died very early in his life at 64. And so there was so much more he could have achieved, I know, and places he could have gone to visit. But it didn't stop him using and seeing the potential in all these wonderful species to create his own hybrids. And this is a particularly lovely hybrid that he created. And it's a ball truss form of a yunnanense, really lovely form. And this is a contrasting hybrid of his, also yunnanense, but in a totally different form. Now, the wonderful thing is we've had some fantastic and inspiring talks already by people who have talked about the plant hunters and experts like Seamus on the actual species rhododendrons and where they come from and where he's seen them. So they were, the plant hunters were funded by very philanthropic people and great families. And they went out, collected the species, and they were brought back and introduced to the countries. And then what happened, as time evolved, the hybridists came along and they used them to create those plants. And that previous slide showed us one of my father's old stud books. We have a series of them. The actual forms that we use now, because we're still actually registering some of his hybrids, and the color charts, the RHS color charts that are very essential when you're dealing with all the registration details. So father started crossing his hybrids, and what he did was he used one of many Dutch light glass houses on the nursery, and he used a double length Dutch light glass house. And we can see, I found an old slide which I photographed, which shows you what they were like, and he actually used that totally for sowing his seed. And he used to sow his rhododendron and azalea seed early in the year, and he would bank up beds, peat beds, two lengths on these double length Dutch light glass houses, and he'd prepare those beds, and he'd use tepid water, warm water to warm the soil. He'd cover it, each section, with a glass frame, and he'd sow the seed, and he would obviously watch it develop. And what I always ceased to find so astonishing was from the very first germination, when the rhododendron azalea seeds came up and they looked like mustard and cress, he could actually say what color that rhododendron was going to be. It was amazing. He knew. And there would be rhododendrons along one side, and this is a picture of much more mature the hybrids as they matured. And you'll see on the right hand side are a lot of the rhododendron hybrids, and on the left hand side the azaleas, the evergreen azaleas mostly, but also some deciduous as well. And in the center were young plants of Camellia donation. But it was thrilling. And then, of course, there were the deciduous azaleas. Now, they had been quite well established by then, and they were out in the trial beds. And these were the high deciduous azaleas that were destined to become the solents. So they were growing along rather nicely, as you can see. Now, the soil, you may have noticed, was a very fine sandy soil. And my father was used to describe it as a continuation of the Bagshot Sands. So although we were at the eastern tip of Dorset, it was an acid soil, ideal for ericaceous plants. So this is how they were growing on. And this particular area, you can see the lines of azaleas. When he wanted to propagate from them, he lifted them. This is before they were lifted, and he laid them on their side, and that's how he layered them. So he banked up the beds, so the surrounding soil was actually made up. The plants were lifted onto their side, and they were all pegged down and layered. And as you can see from just this number, it was quite a task. So when these azaleas were actually acquired by Exbury, by Mr. Edmund de Rothschild, there were lots of layers to go with them as well. But one of my precious memories was of walking with my mother at 6:30 in the morning through the azalea gardens at the nursery. And this is an old picture of what it was like. And the scent on a May morning with glorious sunshine, and also in the evenings, was unbelievably beautiful. And if you look at this picture of the azaleas here in my garden at West Moors, you will get some idea what it was like, because there was a profusion of blooms, and it was like walking through a paradise garden of colour and fragrance. The fragrance I can also recollect as I walked into the big marquee, the old marquees that they used to have at Chelsea Flower Show, and that scent from the deciduous azaleas was overwhelming. Well, this is a picture, again, it's an old historical picture of my father with his grandson, his only grandson, Philip. And this is at our stock ground, because although we had 5 acres of the nursery site, my father had additional stock ground. This is where most of the deciduous azaleas went, and this is where a lot of the open grown plants were grown, because back then there wasn't so much container growing. They were actually grown in open conditions, so they all had to be lifted, of course, in the autumn. Now, again, some of the blooms, these are some of my father's hybrids, and these are named and registered. This is Eternal Flame. Now, many of these plants are actually marketed by David Millay, and this is a very brilliant orange red, and it is a fantastic flame. We just love this one. It's so brilliant. This is one of the yellow hybrids. This is yet unnamed, but you can see it's almost an egg yolk yellow. And this is Chariots of Fire, which is a really good, strong red, bright, brilliant colour. And our newest introduction, actually only registered this year, it's Pamela Mary, named in celebration of a very great plants woman. And it has an enormous truss. I think out of all the hybrids, it has the most floriferous truss. Perfectly Pauline is another more recent introduction, more delicate colours, and with a lovely fragrance. And Fred Nutbean. Now they hold very special memories. And this is Fred Nutbean in the foreground. It's a very good red, which keeps its colour. It doesn't bleach with the sun. It's a good, strong colour. And it was named after Fred Nutbean, who was the legendary head gardener to Her Majesty the Queen at Buckingham Palace. And he was one of the special visitors to the nursery, and we got to know him. He ordered deciduous azaleas for the palace, and those first deciduous azaleas went off. And I remember as a child having very special permission from my headmistress to go with my grandfather and father in our van to Buckingham Palace to actually see the delivery of the azaleas. My father and my grandfather went to supervise it, and they had special passes. And because I didn't have a pass, I wasn't allowed to get out of the van. So my father and grandfather said, no, you've got to sit there. And it was actually a typical February London misty, foggy morning. And Fred came along and he said, oh, your daughter's here. She could have got out of the van. And I remember he was so sweet. He said, well, what a shame. And I'll give you special permission. You can drive very slowly around the back of the palace. And we saw the chandeliers lighting up some of the reception rooms. And he said, but you must drive very carefully because Princess Anne may be out playing with the corgis during her lunch break from her lessons. But we didn't see Princess Anne, sadly. I always remember his kindness. Now, he became a great friend over the years. And when my father died, he gave my mother and I great encouragement to keep going with the nursery. And after his retirement, he's pictured here with my mother and his lovely wife, Frances, at the opening of a special garden in 1983 to celebrate Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone. It's a memorial garden, and it was in Kensington. And Fred designed it. And this lovely lady, Mrs. Gay Christensen on the left-hand side in the foreground, she actually had to put it all together. And my mother supplied a large number of camellias for the garden. And Mrs. Christensen actually worked very hard to keep the garden together, get it all the orders, and keep everybody happy. And she had some frustrating times. And I think she always enjoyed talking to Mummy and unloading some of the frustrations. And at the end of the actual garden being created, she gave my mother a lovely painting that was by Gertrude Jekyll, and much treasured. Gertrude Jekyll was the great friend of Gay's godmother, and that was her memory. Well, this was celebrating the naming of that azalea, Fred Nutbean. We had so hoped that Fred would actually be the person presenting it to Her Majesty the Queen. We gave her a collection of plants for her 70th birthday. Unfortunately, Fred was unwell a few days beforehand, which was a great sadness because it would have been very, very special if he'd actually been able to present it to Her Majesty. These are some of the other plants that mean a lot. Viscosum. Why sometimes I wonder, are these not more widely grown or perhaps seen in the nurseries? Something I feel about the azaleas too. I regard it sometimes that they're looked at as the Cinderellas because other blooms in our genera maybe take precedence, but they all have a place. And this is a viscosum hybrid of father's, which we named Fragrant Memories. It's larger than your typical viscosum. It's pure white, there's no marking, and it has the most delectable fragrance. Another rhododendron is Vasii. I find this enchanting, like little delicate butterflies. It's so exquisitely marked and delicate. That's another one that I do feel sad that we don't see so often. And here in the garden, the Evergreen Azaleas, which I feel are so useful because they make a lovely underplanting. And this is one of our hybrids in my garden. This is Magic Flute. And you can see the combination of colours and the contrast with that lime green colour of the spirea. But you've got this underplanting, very valuable underplanting, great for subduing the weeds too, keeping the moisture, adding that shape, and also the layers. You've got the building up, which is so important. Now, after my father died, he hadn't named any plants, obviously, after himself, but we had to find one that was special. And what should we choose, a rhododendron or an azalea? But we felt an azalea was the best choice. And this is the one that we chose, George Hyde. We really loved it. We loved it for the marking, the shape. It's got the beautiful petaloids inside, and it's very prolific. And it has good foliage as well, because that's another strong consideration. Now, my father had named Evelyn Hyde, which it was an award-winning azalea. It went up to Wisley and it was trialled and it was awarded. But after that, and a few others, one named Beatty after my maternal grandmother, there were so many he hadn't named. So we had to look at names and forms. And I think one of the names I was most excited about being able to register was Magic Flute, because to me, that name really does describe the form of this azalea. It's a hose and hose, and it's a very vibrant purple. There aren't so many hose and hose azaleas actually on the market, but this one has a lovely trumpet. And of course, the form hose and hose goes back to the Elizabethan days, and it was the Tudor style of gentleman's apparel. So the double flowers of this particular azalea also have a fluted edge to the blooms, and this of course inspired the name Magic Flute. Dear Grandad, because we all have a dear granddad somewhere in our history, and of course a dear grandma. So these two have joined the family. But it's azaleas that I grow like Bo Peep that again make me very sad that this is not more widely grown or known. Now, this is quite an old azalea, but isn't that charming? It's just so beautiful. Delicate marking, again, reminds me of little butterflies. And I have grown this and I've given it to various gardens and to growers, because if we don't continue promoting them and growing them, they will be lost, and they could be lost forever. Now, we can see these borders, and it's white too that can highlight a dark corner in your garden. White flowers are so useful, so important. And this is Silver Fountain. This is another of the Hyde introductions, and we called it Silver Fountain because it cascades down like a waterfall. And this is where they have their place in the garden scheme. And perhaps deciduous azaleas, people may think they take up too much room in the garden, they're too big for my garden, but they can be grown in containers. And this is why the evergreen azaleas have so much scope, they have so much versatility that people with alkaline soil can grow them. It's something you can still grow and you can contain, and they're small, they're not going to take a vast amount of space. And if you look at this picture, there are in actual fact 3 plants in descending order. So we start at the top with Chariots of Fire, deciduous azalea. We've then got Christopher, and then we come down to Fred Nutbean, and that's all in a relatively small space in the garden. Well, I would like to go back to the point I made about foliage. Winter foliage in the garden is very precious. Every plant that blossoms in the winter, whether it gives us colour, flower, or scent, is worth 100-fold having. And this is one of the Hyde hybrids, because my father actually assessed them, not just for the flower, but for their foliage colour. So this is in the winter underneath Himalayas pallida, and you can see how very strong that colour is. And here again, in the very early spring, the end of the winter, the colour from the foliage of the azaleas. And this is another hybrid, and this is beneath Himalayas pallida, one of the best yellow Himalayas still. And you can see this burnished bronze, glossy foliage. It's tough, it's hardy. Even after the hardest winters, it's not rebuffed, it will continue. And this is the same azalea, autumn glow, in flower, in that position in the spring. So they give you so much. There's so much to offer. And here again, another bank of azaleas, just to illustrate their worth, and a close-up of Tom Hyde in the winter. And here we see it in flower in the spring, and you can see the contrast between the bronzy or autumn foliage and the green new growth. So lots to offer. Well, let's go through the garden gate to further countries. And if we're thinking about the azaleas, where better to go than Japan? And this is the East Gardens of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Now, as soon as you go to Japan, or even if you go and look at a Japanese garden, you will see how controlled it is. Everything is intricately pruned. Now, I think this may be another reason why some people perhaps don't grow evergreen azaleas as widely as they could, because so often in gardens we see them left to their own devices and they get woody, they get sticky, you don't get so much growth. You must control them, and this is what the Japanese do, because they are incredible pruners. Everything has to be pruned to an immaculate degree. And if you prune your azaleas immediately after they have flowered, now we don't have to do them every year with the evergreens, but if you do them as soon as they have finished flowering, you can get this wonderful effect. You have a complete mound of colour. And as I mentioned, we prune ours, but not every year. But you certainly get that beautiful coverage of bushes. You can hardly, in some cases, see the foliage. Now, these were all kurumi Japanese azaleas in the Imperial Gardens, and you can see them here. Now, many of these kurumi azaleas were doubles. They were hose and hose, which we can actually see in this particular picture. Another very famous garden in Japan is Kenroku-en Gardens. And here we could see how they continue their pruning. Now, this doesn't just cover the azaleas, it covers the pines, all their specimen trees. And they don't just take pieces out with secateurs. To our astonishment, they actually pluck individual needles, and you can get 6 Japanese gardeners up a pine tree, actually tending it, pruning it, and they have sheets beneath where they catch all the needles, so not one needle actually covers the base of the plant. Everything is meticulous, and this extends to 6 lady gardeners that we saw tending the moss, And here they were actually plucking the growth and the green, any green, just a hint of grass was removed. Back-breaking work. And you can see here the little tools they use, the baskets with all the debris. Amazing work. And at Matsui Castle, the actual line of the moat was planted with the Japanese Camellia tsubaki, the old Japonica, the original Japonica camellias, because these were planted years and years ago, because the fruits from the camellias were used to service and oil the weapons used by the samurai warriors. And of course, Matsui Castle was the seat of one of those samurai warlords. But how about this for extreme gardening? How many gardens in Britain do they expect their gardeners to abseil down the walls to actually do the weeding? I think it's astonishing. But those are the lengths they go to in Japan. And at Matsui, this is where you could actually see a close-up of those gardeners. At the castle, this was an area planted with the Hirado azaleas, much larger blooms, distinctly marked. You can see the freckling and the speckling in the flowers. And this is how they were actually signed in a garden in Kyoto that I visited, one of the gardens of many outstanding gardens in Kyoto, but gorgeous blossoms. And here we see them planted as a group, the Hirados, very foliferous and a beautiful setting. I think the other garden that endorses what we're talking about of controlling, pruning, and how we want our azaleas to look, how beautiful they can be, and you could have just one azalea in a pot. This garden is a fantastic example. It's the Dashi Museum of Art, and it is annually recorded the great accolade of being one of the best gardens in Japan by the Journal of Horticulture. And it was the creation of a philanthropist. His name was Adachi, Mr. Adachi, Zenko Adachi, and he was a self-made man. He'd worked incredibly hard to create his fortune, and he was a great lover of the arts, and he wanted somewhere to share his incredible collection of Japanese art with the public. So he built a museum. So the museum came before the garden. The garden came after the museum. So this is the entrance to the museum, and immediately you're aware of a very typical and beautiful garden around the museum. Now, this is a stroll garden, but you can't stroll in it. You view it from a series of plate glass windows because it is immaculate. The gravel is great in such a form to tell you a story, as Japanese gardens do. And Mr. Dachi was so influenced by paintings, particularly those of islands and oceans, that this is what inspired what he wanted. And so lots of cloud pruning, as we can see here in the foreground. This is where the mounds of azaleas emulate the clouds scudding through the sky. And this was what it was all about, the connection with nature. And what you can do with just a little azalea plant or a pine that you can actually trim to your requirements. But he was a clever man too, because not all that you see belongs to the estate. He's using the borrowed landscape, just as Capability Brown did. So those trees in the background on the horizon don't belong to the garden. It is not as large as you would seem. It's an illusion, an optical illusion. But what a beautiful backcloth, and how cleverly he's used it. And here we can see more of that cloud pruning. And you can see why they are so particular about the pines, because they keep the shapes, and they do this with the aces as well. And some of these trees are very old indeed, and we don't think of them as such because, rather like a bonsai, they are trimmed to requirements. At the Tokijo temple, we're going to look at azaleas used as hedging, and this is something that is quite easily achieved. And this is the Satsuki hybrid azaleas. This is the group. They're quite similar to the Heradas, but a more delicate marking, as you can see, and just rather than a speckling, you've got this hint of green, which is suffused into the uppermost corollas of the blossoms. And there, as you can see from my little piece, the indicum crossed with Simsii was introduced by Sugar Nursery to Kobe to America in 1938. And of course, a lot of these early azaleas were ones that promoted later hybrids. So we're back to where we began. And this is Beatty. This was named after my maternal grandmother. So azaleas in particular are my passion. And I can remember as a girl being very busy on the nursery, doing a lot of the propagating of azaleas, the evergreen azaleas. And we had conditions that the propagating house, it was a very large boiler that it gave us the power at that time. And it was in a pit, and that kept a lot of the heating pipes to give the warmth for the propagating to the actual benches and the inside frames. And then later on, it was superseded by the electric cables on the outside frames, and that's where I would propagate the azaleas. I can remember longing to do camellias, but not allowed. It came later. That was very much father's prerogative. Well, lovely memories. And in later years, my mother at Exbury, and this is with the Solents. The Solents were acquired by Mr. Edmund de Rothschild in the 60s. 11 went up to Chelsea, and they were accepted for trials. And that was in 1961. And before the week had ended, Freddie Winiot, who was the head gardener at Exbury at that time, came with Mr. Eddy, and Mr. Eddy wanted to buy the complete collection, and they went to Exbury, and they were named by Exbury. And this one was named by Exbury Princess Margaret. But there were other hybrids that came afterwards, and these were some that were launched at Chelsea in 2011 by David Millay, and they were named after our 4 grandchildren, who were quite tiny there. They're really quite grown up now, but that was back in 2011. So we have Charlotte Megan. These were Homebush crosses of my father, and David and I chose the ones we thought were the most outstanding out of a collection, and David grew them on for me. I sent the material, and it just seemed appropriate that 4 of these azaleas would be named after the grandchildren. And there were 3 pinks and 1 red. So we only have 1 grandson, and that was Thomas David. So that was the red. Since which time Olivia was launched at Chelsea Flower Show in 2019. This is a beautiful rhododendron. We have it here actually in our garden, and it's got this sort of chiffon-like texture and a beautiful fragrance. You can smell it across the garden when it's flowering, and David has that growing at his nursery. And one of the newer ones, Artistic Meg, this is being grown for us, and that's being grown by Mark and Lorraine Jackson, who have a nursery in Dorset, and they are very active members, like David of the RCM group. They're great supporters of our group, and they too grow some really exciting plants, and they actually grow the full range of the Hyde Evergreen Azalea hybrids for us. So you can actually see them there. Now, there were 2 Camellia hybrids. My father did a bit of Camellia hybridization, but sadly he never saw these flower. He died before they flowered, but he must have known exactly what he was aiming for, because he called this one Near Me, and it was a pink, and this one is called Philip. And Pat Short is actually, she has the registration of this one, and it's going through to the registrar at China at the moment. The registrar for camellias is in China. The registrar for rhododendrons, Sharon MacDonald, is here in the UK at Wisley. And that's an interesting camellia, because I would appreciate members' comments, but I think it has a bit of a look of the Higo about it, the Higo camellias. It's not a true Higo, of course, but there's something, I think, about the stamens, which are very generous. Well, we wouldn't have this wonderful legacy if it wasn't for my father. And I think I was truly blessed to grow up in a nursery. He had the expertise, he had the knowledge, and here he is with our daughter as a little girl, and he's holding Rhododendron Verona, which I think was actually at first flower, if I recall. It's a long time ago. So that's a very interesting rhododendron. We named it Verona because I managed to get a series of Shakespearean names. A lot, of course, were taken, but not Verona. And this is how it looked this spring. It's a very fine, large plant now, and it was covered in blossom, really beautiful. So it evoked a lot of very poignant memories. And I think I am very fortunate to have those memories. When Gwendolyn asked me to do this talk, she said, "Rosemary, what's your favorite rhododendron?" And I said, "Oh, goodness, that is difficult." Well, I love Edgeworthii, but if I could only have one rhododendron, it would have to be Rosemary Hyde, the azalea that my father named after me, and that would be my choice. Well, it has been a great pleasure to talk to you this evening, and I wish you lots of happiness in your gardens. I'm sure you'll all be rushing out with the hose now to water those thirsty plants. And take care, and it has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful, Rosemary. If you would like to stop sharing your screen now, we'll be able to see you. And if anybody has any questions, they can put them in the chat to me now, and I will give those questions to Rosemary. I'm just going to try and find you because I seem to have lost you, Rosemary, on the main view. Have we actually? I think she might have accidentally closed herself down. I wonder if she will notice. I hope she'll notice. We seem to have lost her. Let's just give her a call. I haven't had this happen with a speaker before. Call her and see. Sorry. No answer. Well, I'm very sorry, everybody. I think we all were really looking forward to hearing hearing a bit more from Rosemary. She's on answer phone. But we might have to just wait. Oh, here she is. She's back. She's back. Let's see if she's going to appear for us. Let's make her co-host again. Rosemary, have we got you? We lost you. Oh, you're on mute, Rosemary.
There we are.
You're back. Wonderful.
Back.
Oh, I'm so glad you came back.
I'm so sorry. It must be the heat.
That's all right. I was going to try and get speaker view again. Okay, here we are. Speaker view. Lovely. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Rosemary. I think you really brought azaleas to life for us tonight. And also, I'm really, really looking forward to you writing your memoirs at some point in the future, because I feel we've only had a very small taste tonight of your absolutely fascinating life in azaleas and rhododendrons. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. I've certainly got a couple of things I want to ask, but we've got some questions that have come in. So let's have a look at those. This one is from Christian, and they say, what time of year was your visit to Bhutan, and what region of Bhutan was it?
Very interesting. It was April into May in Bhutan. That wasn't with that particular expedition, wasn't with the RCM group, and we actually went to central Bhutan. So the Bumtang Valley.
Did you go to the Rhododendron Festival in April or in Thimphu?
No, I loved. We didn't, sadly. That would have been fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. We have another question from Leon, and he says, Rosemary, thank you for a wonderful and interesting talk. Oh no, that wasn't a question. That was just a wonderful comment.
Oh, that's very kind.
And who we have? Your father was a storyteller. Rosemary, you and you certainly are as well, we have as a comment. I'm not quite sure. Perhaps that was from Leon. Yes, it is. Sorry, the Bhutan question was actually from Seamus. Sorry, Seamus. That was from you.
I'm going to give you a talk, aren't I, in January on Bhutan?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, the RCM talks, you're going to give us an expeditions talk, aren't you? And that's early next year, when everybody's going to be feeling a bit chilly compared to now. But one of the things that I really noticed was how the azaleas, you have shown them to be really rather beautiful and versatile.
Yes.
And for many of us, I think, and I know you feel quite strongly about this, that azaleas have rather been seen as a Cinderella, you call them, that really we see them in a very old-fashioned way, where for a lot of people they have an association with the 1960s, because that's when, that's exactly when everybody was beginning to do the hybridizing, and we were getting a lot of activity happening with azaleas. But what it seemed to me tonight, particularly with you showing the gardens in Japan and some of the more incredibly delicate azaleas that you were talking about as well, some of those lovely ones like Bo Peep and the very, very light coloured azaleas, that they really are being brought up to date. I think perhaps you might be starting a revolution where azaleas are going to be able to be brought back into gardens again and seen in a very different way.
Yes.
Do you feel that that is there in the sort of Japanese aesthetic, that it is quite different than the UK aesthetic that we have, that for most people seems to originate in the 1960s?
I think what I saw when I was in Japan, I don't know whether they had the vast introductions that we've had since. I mean, when you look at some of the Glendales in America and all the introductions, there's more that they've got their very traditional varieties, which they've stayed with.
Yes.
I think the trouble is, I think a lot of it is the marketing of the azaleas, because there is more scope and there are so many more. And again, that could be done with some of the traditional varieties, the ones that I'm so concerned might disappear. And I know people like Polly has done tremendous work on the Wilson collection of them, as we saw in the yearbook. Amazing. But it's so vital we don't lose those very precious azaleas, the collections. But when you think about it, if you go to a garden centre, they only offer the public a very basic collection. And a lot of them come from the continent. And we have growers here, and we have growers that have created a lot of different varieties. And it's a great shame in a way that we don't promote them all. But I think, yes, there's a versatility. There's a place for everybody's garden for them.
And I particularly liked how you talked about the layers and the building up of the layers in the garden, because, you know, that particularly with some of the larger rhododendrons, we have that, you know, more of an empty space at the base there, that in a small, particularly in, you know, smaller gardens, I mean, places like Minton, you know, it's like being in the Himalayas, so it doesn't really affect in the same way, but in a smaller garden, that building up of the layers can be really important, because you're making the most of the space you've got, aren't you?
Yes.
So that was really nice, the way you were able to show that, particularly in your garden.
You can maximize the space that you have got with them.
Yes, get the most out of the flower.
Yes.
And there was also something I noticed about the rhododendrons that you were talking about. Some of the purples that you were showing, the blue purples, really rather stunning. And again, a little bit like the azaleas, some of the purples I know have got a bit of a bad name because of too much of an association with Ponticum. and you know, rather out of fashion with that.
Yes.
But really, is what you've shown again tonight, because you've given us such a great scope, and you know, those fantastic purples in Bhutan, we really are missing out if we don't embrace those, I think.
Yes, and I think for Augustinia unionense, they're just so beautiful, and again, not too large for people's gardens today.
No, which is very nice. Again, bringing in that middle layer.
Yes, not all of us can accommodate huge rhododendrons.
No,
sadly, and
so. Just thinking about being, you know, 35 feet up and that sort of thing. It doesn't fit everybody's garden, does it?
No.
We have a question from.
Can I just jump in for a minute? That was a fascinating talk, Rosemary. I absolutely loved it. But I'm going to have to leave you now because I need to do something else at 5:30. So well, thank you very much, and it's been delightful.
Thank you, Mary. That's very kind of you.
Thank you. We have another question from Nick Butler. He says, does the nursery still exist in any form?
Nick, no, sadly, we sold it in the late 80s. So, I mean, it is still a nursery. They've had several different owners, but we moved it from its original position. My father, it was a trade nursery. And after he died, we had to expand into retail. but we had to move the position. It wasn't a good retail position. So we bought 10 acres of rough land, and that was quite literally at Matravers, actually. And that was very challenging because there was no water, there was no drainage, there was no electricity, and it was not a level site. So it had to be developed in different levels. We had to sink a borehole, and then we had to pump the water from the borehole up to an acid dosing unit to get the pH right, because the water was alkaline. But that was a great asset because we could control our water, and that was very important. So it was quite challenging. There was a lot to do with no facilities there. You know, we had to create everything, and the terracing, and build the glass houses, series of tunnels, paraweb screening. Yeah, there was a lot to do, but it gave us scope. And so we could continue to grow for the trade and also retail. And so we expanded on the outlets, which was great. But it's changed ownership. I think probably their third owners now from when we sold it.
Yeah.
But they don't hybridize it. And they don't, I don't really know currently how much they grow themselves, but they probably grow a fair bit.
Mm-hmm.
And they did, the people who bought it from us actually, they continued. We had the young man who became their nursery manager, we'd actually trained, he'd gone to horticultural college, and that was lovely that he continued with them. So we were pleased about that. But when I was a child, father he supplied a lot of the rural parks, and he also supplied there were George Thompson was actually creating the Isabella plantation at Richmond Park, and he was just creating that, and he used to come regularly and order plants. In fact, I think many of those original plants came from our nursery. So a lot of those really, really established azaleas, and he would have had rhododendrons too. Blue diamond, we grew quite a lot of blue diamond, for example, and some of the smaller rhododendrons, Silpenense, Milpenense, a lot of lovely rhododendron hybrids, brocade. Oh, so many. Temple Bell, and they would have gone to those gardens. So yes,
it's wonderful that Fred Nutbean encouraged you to keep going with the nursery after your father passed away, because it's, you know, it seems to me, just hearing you tonight, that there is so much knowledge, expertise, and not just that, but it's a feeling for the plants that really would have been not had the same continuation had you not continued, you and your mother, in the same way.
It's kind of you to say so. He was a lovely friend, and he gave us that confidence to carry on.
Yes.
When my father died so suddenly, he had a coronary. He was actually watering his rhododendron hybrids and had the hose in his hand.
Well, if it's the way to go, it couldn't be better for him, could it?
And so it was for a grower,
yes.
but an awful shock for us, and
yes.
We were a bit like a ship without a captain, because he had the expertise, and he had the skills. So yes, so Fred gave us a lot of wonderful encouragement.
But listening to you talk about your father's skills, and I think this is where, for me, it's wonderful to have the plant passions discussion, because it's not just about the knowledge or the expertise. It's also about the experience of doing it, and particularly with you talking about how your father knew what colour was going to come out when they were absolutely tiny. That's a real feeling for the plants, And that's something that in a way can't be taught. It almost has to be imbibed. And growing up with your father, I think that that sense of the plants definitely comes across in the way you talk about them. So that's a way of passing on, really, that feeling for the plants. But thank you so much today, Rosemary. It's been wonderful to have you. And I know we were competing with a rather spectacular sunny day this evening. However, we are going to have your talk put onto our YouTube channel, and the link will be on Instagram and also on our Facebook page. So nobody's going to miss out on being able to see you tonight. And thank you so much again for a wonderful talk. I'm going to unmute everybody now so that we can all give you a show of our appreciation. Just unmute everyone.
Thanks, Rosemary.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Seamus.
Rosemary, that was wonderful. And actually, I'll tell you what was really good was that you put travel in at a time when none of us can travel. It was just wonderful. I loved your photographs of Bhutan. I loved that photograph of Rhododendron racemose and Indian ants. And, you know, what really makes a lecture as well is when you have a bit of garden history in there. That was one of the best lectures I've sat down to watch in a long time. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Really
Oh, Seamus, thank you so much. I mean, that's praise indeed from you. Thank you so
loved
much.
It. Absolutely loved it, Rosemary.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you all.
But thank
My
you,
pleasure.
everybody. And
Take care.
good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.